Okay, welcome to everyone. We are just after 2 p.m. in the UK, so greetings to wherever you're coming from. Thank you for joining this Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. My name is David Mills, and it's a real pleasure to be welcoming back Emma Harden-Wolff. Emma's a CG regular. I think you've done webinars in the past for us. And you're going to be talking about this UNESCO report, which you can see on the front slide, Reaching for the Right to Higher Education, Evidence in 15 Countries. Emma is based in McGill University in Canada and is going to talk for about 20 minutes. Please do use the chat to post questions, comments, and responses. We always really value those conversations. Emma, the screen's yours. We look forward to hearing about your work.
Excellent, thank you. And David, if I'm going to just start, and if anything seems to be amiss either with my video or the slides, just jump in and please let me know, because now I'm screen sharing, I can only see my slides. So thank you very much for having me back at CG. It's always a pleasure to join this group and to be able to share new and ongoing work with colleagues who are connected in with the centre. So I'm Dr. Emma Harden-Wolff, and I'm an assistant professor at McGill University. Prior to joining McGill a couple of years ago, I was working as head of research and foresight at UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, leading on a number of different higher education related projects, including a very important one that still remains very compelling on the right to higher education. So what I'm going to talk to you about today reflects some work that I have continued to do with UNESCO. And the core issue that we have at hand here is not just the fact of the right to higher education, which seems to remain disputed and in question in some corners, despite being enshrined in legislation, but the fact of trying to make that right a reality for all. So there's a QR code on the screen in case you want to connect to the report that was published very recently, and you'll see the nice images also on the report. I'll show the QR code at the end as well. So it's very easy to lose sight of progress that's been made towards the right to higher education in the face of global challenges. Some of these are new, some of them are recurring. So I want to just start by perhaps flipping the narrative a little bit and illustrate some positive transformations with three quick statistics. So first, pipeline of people who are eligible to go into higher education has expanded. So for example, we know that illiteracy rates are down, access to school education is up, provision of education in general has been expanded. And so since 2000, we have 60% increase in upper secondary school completion, which has converted into meaning 60% more people finishing school. In turn, we've now, if you look around the world, we have a gross enrollment rate ratio which is at the highest it's ever been. So it's reached 40% now, which is double the percentage since the turn of the century, which converts in global terms to being over 260 million students in higher education. And if we look ahead to projections about enrollment, it's estimated that by 2040, a year which is coming up faster than I think we might be expecting, around a quarter of the world, or 25%, will have some kind of higher education. So that seems to set a relatively positive baseline, particularly in light, as I mentioned, of these many challenges. Where does that leave us then in terms of the current status of the right to higher education? Well, you can probably imagine that we're not quite there yet. If we were, this kind of work wouldn't be needed. We'd be out there celebrating rather than urging us to reach continually towards the right to higher education. So we had a number of questions still to ask. These include the ones that you see now on the screen. Are some policies and practices designed to improve equity in higher education more prevalent than others? What measures can be taken to know whether these policies and practices are effective? Which equity deserving groups remain the most vulnerable? And how can the right to higher education for all, but especially for students from equity deserving groups, be assured? These are big questions, I know. We don't have, I wish we had the answers to them, and I wish the answers were straightforward, but looking for responses and looking for answers to these questions sets the context for the ambitious and ongoing global project that's been initiated by the UNESCO Institute I have been working for. We use ESALC, UNESCO ESALC as the Spanish language acronym. And that's a project we started in around 2021. The idea being to build up the evidence base and therefore the scope for advocacy on the right to higher education. So what have we already managed to do since that period? The answer is quite a lot. There's still obviously a lot of work to be done. Our contributions so far include 15 national case studies. I'll speak a little bit more about those in the context of this new report. It includes 9 regional and thematic consultations on the right to higher education. These were organised involving academics, activists, higher education leaders, students, of course, policymakers, youth representatives from around the world. We organised 4 high-profile events at the 2022 World Higher Education Conference. One of those events was a ministerial panel on what it would take to achieve higher education for all. We had a contribution from the then Special Rapporteur on the right to education, a youth panel looking at higher education as a human right. We've developed a social justice framework, and then all of this has kind of led to, although not perhaps in entirely the linear way that the arrow on the screen suggests, the report Reaching for the Right to Higher Education, evidence from 15 countries that we published in December 2024. The report takes stock of and summarises key findings regarding the policies, challenges and possibilities that emerge from the 15 national case studies that I just mentioned. You can see on the map here where those case studies are distributed. So in alphabetical order, they were Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador, England, Ghana, Haiti, India, Jamaica, Morocco, Peru, Portugal, South Africa, and Türkiye. So you'll see that the case studies were concentrated in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you're at all familiar with the work of UNESCO ESALC, that will be no surprise. The region has historically been, well, it's located in Venezuela and now more recently also with an office in Uruguay. This is where ESALC has its kind of, it's historically where the research and advocacy efforts have been concentrated, but you'll also see with the global spread how ESALC's work has now taken on over the last years much more of an international and comparative focus. So we have selected world countries, selected countries from other world regions also included. We selected each country based on recent policy efforts aimed specifically at the right to higher education. Excuse me. So it wasn't just a case of let's look around the map and put a pin and that's where we'll choose. There was a very deliberate selection process that went on. And each of the case studies was authored by somebody with deep and authentic expertise of that particular context. All the case studies are published. They're available in English and in Spanish. They are on UNESCO's digital library. So the case studies and then sort of the framing for each of the case studies, so they follow a kind of common template, and the new report, Reaching for the Right to Higher Education, are informed by this social justice framework that I was able to develop with colleagues at UNESCO ESALC. So the idea with the framework here is that it highlights the unfair distribution and lack of equitable access to higher education and the need for both systems and institutions of higher education to change in order to accommodate students' diverse backgrounds and needs. And so you'll see here from the graphic that the framework's made up of 4 different perspectives. We start in this kind of outer or like macro layer, if you like, informed by what was the 4 A's framework on human rights. You might know that from as developed by Tomaszewski in the early 2000s, with an additional A to speak about the importance of education being available, accessible, acceptable, adaptable, and accountable. So that outlines kind of states' human rights obligations in relation to education. We then move to the second layer, which is the kind of the white background that kind of cuts through everything that's in the middle. This is the idea of inclusive excellence. So here we're thinking about the impetus on higher education institutions to make purposeful changes that have a positive impact on student achievement and well-being. The third element of the framework are the representative circles in the inside, just that we have 5 here. That's just for illustrative purposes. The idea is that that could be multiple different ones. So here we're thinking about students from different equity deserving groups. So this does 2 things. The first is it shifts the focus away from students being at a deficit, and rather flips the importance or the impetus for change onto systems and institutions. The second thing that does is it brings to fore this terminology of equity deserving groups, which I've adopted from a Canadian-based professor who introduced that some years ago. So here we're thinking about students such as, depending on your context, this could be indigenous groups, it could be persons with disabilities, it could be people with limited financial means, it could be women, it could be LGBTQI plus individuals, it could be displaced populations, rural communities. Again, this is very context dependent. And then the fourth part of the framework here is a really important one, is this idea, which colleagues may be familiar with, of intersectionality. So the idea being that disadvantage often doesn't sit alone kind of in a silo. So, if you're a woman, you may also be a woman with disabilities or a woman who's a member of an indigenous community. So those dotted lines are kind of connecting together different identities and therefore different kind of barriers, frankly, which students have faced in higher education. So we use that framework both to inform the organisation of the case studies and the selection of countries for the case studies, but also in the report to help develop a new typology to analyse these different equity policies in the 15 countries that we had featured in the first round. So we think this provides a comprehensive understanding of the types of policy instruments that governments are using to support the right to higher education. So the categories in summary here, starting in the top right of the screen, is funding for students, information, infrastructure, pathways, quotas, and regulations. So they're just listed here in alphabetical order. It's not intended to imply any kind of hierarchy other than an alphabetical one. So some of the policy instruments then are pre-distributive in the sense that they seek to reduce inequality, for example, through regulation, whereas others are redistributive. So funding for students would be an example of that kind of policy in terms of dispersing public finances in order to improve equality. So obviously this is a typology, it's simplified, and therefore it comes, of course, with a couple of health warnings. I devised the typology based on the practices that we saw in these 15 case study countries. So while we know that the typology can be adaptable to a range of experiences, obviously you need to bear in mind that countries use a mix of policy instruments to address the right to higher education. And of course, within each country, there's significant variation in the context. As well, we see that, many times policies will cut across categories. So the typology here is simply designed to kind of bring out some of the main features, not to be like an exclusive designator. So for government policymakers to say, today we're going to focus only on quotas. The idea is that this is just bringing out some of the key characteristics. So I'll briefly introduce now each of the categories and give you some examples of the kinds of policies that we saw in the case study countries that work towards each of these. So I'll start with funding, partly because of the alphabet, but also because this funding for students was clearly the most common kind of policy instrument that we see used in support of the right to higher education. So 11 of the 15 national case study countries had some kind of funding policy for students. So scholarships, again, featured most prominently. Often those were targeted to different groups of equity deserving students. That might also be financial aid programs, which could be kind of larger than scholarships alone. They might, for example, combine some element of scholarship, loan, grant. There might be programs with conditions attached to them, like post-study work, or they might not. We see student loans, and then we also included free higher education, as in free for students in this. So here that would imply that the state undertakes to cover the cost of providing teaching and supporting institutions. In those cases, which are still pretty rare, there may be additional or alternative funding from private providers, like privately run higher education institutions or privately funded scholarships, but the core funding in free higher education is assumed to be governmental. We don't see any higher education system in the world, not in these 15 case study countries, not anywhere else, that provides free higher education for all students. However, other work that we've done at ESALC suggests that about 30% or just under 30% of countries guarantee free public higher education through legal mandates. In our case studies, the case study to look at if you're interested in finding out more about this concept is Chile. And then we also have these other policy examples that you can see in the blue box. So we have programs from Brazil, Colombia, Peru, the financial aid program in Jamaica, and then a very long-standing, very large budget educational loan scheme in India. So that's the first element of the typology. The second is information, which is a policy tool governments used to provide communication and also to require information. So it's kind of at least two-way, right? From government, but information coming into government. And that information may typically come from higher education institutions, but it could also be designed either for students or from students. So in terms of the provision of information and guidance to students, we see that information as a tool can be used, can be kind of mobilized to better articulate pathways for students, for example, in preparation for their admission to higher education, and then to support them after enrollment, although that was a little bit less widespread. We see policies that require information from higher education institutions. I'm using the acronym HEI on the screen here. Shift the focus from using information to support the students to using information, not just to get the information, but to use that as a way to kind of stimulate institutional level change. So the examples that we have in the report come from Argentina, Chile, and then closer to home for many of you joining the webinar today through England's access and participation plans. Moving on, infrastructure. We saw two kind of different ways that this policy mechanism was used. The first was to create new higher education institutions. The second then to look at existing higher education institutions, but to invest in improving their infrastructure, which could be, for example, through new campuses or through improving the provision of student accommodation, as you can see, which was our example from Morocco. And in that case, that was specifically designed to improve the number of beds, but also the amount of provision for female students in that country. Obviously, those require significant resources. You've got to build a new higher education institution. That's a major investment. But what I thought was interesting was that we see this kind of policy used across countries within our case study selection with very different economic capacities. And so typically the reason then given for this sort of major investment is to expand the provision of higher education to either regions which are unserved or have been underserved by higher education in the past. So they have this kind of important aim of trying to address regional imbalances, and in doing so, often then have a secondary or double primary aim of better serving equity deserving groups. So in the report, we talk about the initiative to create public universities of the region in Haiti, very interesting kind of vocational technical level higher education called Megatech in El Salvador, which has brought higher education, tertiary education to regions which didn't have any kind of provision at all. a major national campaign for higher education in India, and then, as mentioned, the expansion of provision of student accommodation in Morocco. We move on to pathways policies. So typically these are policies designed to expand access to higher education, either by opening alternative routes into higher education or creating or facilitating flexible learning pathways by, for example, enabling the recognition of non-traditional forms of merit, which I've put in little quote marks here because it's a bit of a disputed concept, I think. We see these policies in systems that have admissions requirements. So if you could compare that to systems that are open to all, anyone can go to higher education, then it's unlikely that they would need pathways policies. And the aim is typically to expand access to those who've been underrepresented. So one of the examples, a very good case study from Portugal, which looks at it's called the Plus M23 pathway policy to improve access for mature students, those aged over 23, into or without a high school diploma, into undergraduate education there. So in that sense, pathway policies can also act as broader vehicles to improve credential articulation and transfer. So in systems where there are different kinds of institutions, that could be, for example, university, college, polytechnic, other forms of higher education institution, these kind of policies can support coordination and better transfer for students between different levels and different parts of the overall higher education system. So some very interesting examples. All of the examples are interesting, but for pathways policies, as mentioned, we have examples from Portugal, also from Argentina, India, and then Jamaica's introduction of a national qualifications framework, which many countries have, but some are introducing or considering at this time. So it's quite interesting to see how that's playing out in this kind of contemporary context. So 2 more to go. The penultimate one that we feature is quotas. And so quotas are often, if not always, I think often used in combination with other policy measures like student funding typically, or in the design of alternative pathways into higher education. So because of the nature of being quotas, they don't focus on all potential students in higher education, but rather they target specific equity deserving groups. On the screen, you can see a list of the groups that we identified from the case study. So that's the students who are identified as Black, indigenous and mixed race, also students from those groups who are from low income backgrounds. Remember back to the point about intersectionality, you don't just have a kind of single identity or marker. We saw other quotas designed for students with disabilities, for female students, and for refugee students. So we look in as examples to the 2012 quota law from Brazil. Then in Ghana, we look at, interestingly, not at system level, but institutional level policies on quotas for females and students from less well-resourced schools. And then in Türkiye, we have a very interesting case study that focuses on Syrian refugees and how they have been enabled or not to access higher education in Türkiye. So then the final part of the typology comes with regulation. We've seen policies in the case studies that lead to the creation of regulatory bodies to address concerns typically around accountability of higher education providers, but also quality in the higher education system. And that often seems to align with concerns or be in response to concerns around rapid expansion and or privatization of higher education systems, and therefore related concerns from a government perspective about the quality of provision. We see regulation also applied more broadly to promulgate equitable frameworks for higher education, which we differentiate from laws on higher education, which many countries have, because those laws would be setting a more general purpose. Here's the legislative baseline for the operation of education or higher education. So some of the examples that we look at in the case studies include SUNEDU, which is the Peruvian National Superintendency of Higher Education, which has subsequently been mired with all kinds of interesting political issues. We look at England's Office for Students, and then we look a little bit back in time, but still fairly recent, to the Education White Paper 3 and the National Plan for Higher Education coming out of South Africa. So that's a kind of brief overview of these 6 types of policy tools that we identify in the report. In the report, we also, offer further insights into how much the needle has moved on equity, but at the same time, what more still needs to be done. And those are some issues that we put on the table. And we also think about how policies would change if they were to address structural inequities, not just individual constraints. So that leads us in the report to identify a number of key messages, 6 to be precise, which I'd like to share with you as well. So the first one, and perhaps the most important, I think, and it might seem fairly obvious, but it's therefore worth restating and making sure that it remains high up on the agenda and not just implied. So in the context of growing demand, we know that financing is the biggest challenge to achieving the right to higher education. And these twin pressures, right? So growing demand on the one hand, financial issues on the other hand, raise questions about states' obligations to provide higher education in the context of the clear inclusion of the right to higher education in international law. And I briefly mentioned free higher education at the beginning. That's something that student groups in particular have been lobbying hard for, but those calls, as you're probably aware, have largely gone unheeded. The second key message is that improving participation rates of students from equity deserving groups should be legally mandated. We have seen progress that's been made through, for example, targeted scholarships. And again, have a look at the case study of Brazil, which has been quite active in this area. But the baseline is often extremely low. And some equity deserving groups, particularly students with disabilities and students who are refugees, remain extremely underserved by higher education. The third is that the right to higher education goes beyond access. Student success, or however you'd like to call that, in some contexts I've seen that as well-being, belonging, thriving, is equally critical. So many of the policies in the case studies relate primarily to access. And that's fantastic, right? We widen the number of people who can come in to higher education. We also look at how they're going to be funded, but then once they're in higher education, are those students continuing to be supported? What's the policy framework for that to ensure that once they're in higher education, those students can succeed in whatever way success means for that individual student? So that we consider to be equally critical, but has received much less attention within policies. So the fourth is about combining policy measures, and I hinted at that when I talked about quotas. We see that in cases where not just one of these kind of policy tools is chosen, but a combination of them, increases the likelihood of achieving the right to higher education. We don't, however, have very much evidence, either from among the case studies or globally, of comprehensive policy measures being taken as it relates to the right to higher education. The fifth, and I feel like anybody's presentation ever will always have this recommendation or key message, is that we need more data to help improve the evidence baseline, which in turn could support positive change. In some countries, it's challenging to access any kind of basic data pertaining to even just access to higher education, let alone fully thinking about the right to higher education. And obviously, without having that data, it's difficult to know where we're at and therefore where we could be going. That, as with many things, comes with a health warning. Data isn't the only solution, but it is part of the story, and it is part of the way that I think we can help ourselves and help higher education move in directions which is more equitable for everybody. The final key message is about technology. I was very surprised among the case studies that only one of the 15 looks at technology, and that's the case of India with a very interesting program called Swayam. But other countries, and perhaps we missed some, perhaps these weren't ones that were featured by our case study authors, and things are obviously continually changing. However, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the potential of digital technology to support the right to higher education remains untapped. Here we could be thinking about how could blockchain help to facilitate credential recognition? Are there ways which AI, suitably ethically harnessed and critically applied, could support the right to higher education? It's not necessarily an untrammeled good to have digital technology, but that potential, I think, could be sensibly, ethically considered in more detail and related to how policies operate. So those are the 6 key messages. I'm going to finish up with a number of recommendations, which are designed for policymakers, but I think that's equally important for other people, whether you're a researcher, whether you're an activist, whether you're currently a student yourself. I think it's important that we kind of share these among different groups to understand where are the points that we could be leaning towards in terms of making those positive changes to enhance the right to higher education. So these are big recommendations, but I think you have to have these because you've got to have things to work towards. So the first is transitioning towards removing the cost of higher education away from students. The second is around regulation. So regulating higher education, not just access, but what I talked about as success to reduce inequalities. Third, ensuring equal access to different forms of higher education provision, whether that's by creating these new institutions or branch campuses or online forms of higher education or thinking about admissions requirements. There's a number of different ways that all of these recommendations can be achieved. Fourth is to improve higher education accountability and efficiency through data and reporting. So depending on the context, that might be about collecting data, or it might be about using the data, making the data publicly available. And finally, as comes out from one of the key messages, the final recommendation is around harnessing digital technologies more effectively to improve the right to higher education. So that, in about 20 minutes or however long that was, is a run through of some of the highlights that we have from the report. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a chance to access the report, read it through in more detail. Also to access the national case studies where each of these sets of policies goes into much more detail. Really fascinating reading. So really I'm grateful for your attention. Thank you to David and to the team at CG and to Daniel for the opportunity to present today. And I look forward to hearing your comments and to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. That was a brilliant run through the report, and it really is excellent the way you've summarised so many different issues. We have some questions coming in the chat already, but I'm going to sort of set the conversation going by just commenting on your one of your points around data. Because it seems to me that that came in both recommendation and further research. To what extent do you think that data constrains what people do? As in, if you haven't got the data, there's certain things you can't even begin to know where the inequalities are. And so, to what extent are countries across your case studies worrying about that? And is it much easier to do a more finely grained equity policy if you have really good data? I mean, I guess it's obvious it is, but I don't know whether you wanted to comment on that aspect.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And when we come to these kind of key message and recommendations around data, I'm always, as you might imagine, somewhat hesitant to push too far down the line of datification, because I think, once you do that, you run the risk of, as we always do when we rely on statistics, of thinking that we've achieved some kind of objectivity, when in fact what we've done is, we've introduced another level of subjectivity on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we collect data and we potentially miss, the really crucial fact of people's actual lives and lived experiences, which sits underneath it. So I think all of that is a bit more, is kind of an additional bit of health warning, if you like, around the use of data. That being said, I could imagine, so 2 countries come immediately to mind from the case studies, the one being England, which has an incredibly sophisticated series of initiatives around data collection by institutions and provision and publication of that data by the Office for Students. And I think in this world, we're thinking about, and that data is, it's used on the one hand to create accountability between institutions, government, and society more generally. And that, I think, is a really interesting model, and it's not one that we see, certainly among the case studies, I think, that's been so generative. The other case study that's coming to mind is the case study of Jamaica, where And I'm remembering now some iterations that we had with the author of the case study, and we would say, I think I remember asking, oh, could you just put in a bit of data here? Could you help guide us here? This. And the answer was, I'd love to, but we're not collecting the data, and it's not readily available. So being able to set that baseline would be something which, in this case, the case study author felt would be very valuable, because, as I mentioned, it becomes a case of, here's where we're at, and therefore here's where we need to go forward. So if you can employ data in that way, with all the health warnings that I've taken into consideration, that we should take into consideration, then I think it could serve that kind of purpose as well.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting about the peer accountability. Of actually, it's not. It's actually so you can. I mean, by you want to rank it, create another ranking, but it does create a sort of sense of, okay, we'll set a target, and can you be held to account for that target? Yeah, Rachel, you're first in the chat. Please do, everyone. Remember, you can post questions in the chat and respond to Emma's report. Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma. That was really interesting, and it links to some work we're currently doing in CG on this kind of topic. I suppose my question for you, and maybe it also links to what you just said in relation to data, was kind of, how did you decide which policy measures to include and which not to include, and what was the kind of evidence base for that? Because I was just thinking about some of the English ones that you talked about, and I think some people might argue that the Office for Students has had a negative impact on increasing equity rather than a positive one. So I was just wondering, how you made the decision about what's going to go into your your policy recommendations and the evidence base for that. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And I might come back to you and ask you to share a bit more about the points you made on the Office for Students there. So our kind of main input at this was to really think about, to use our existing knowledge and understanding, and then the knowledge and understanding of kind of our networks in the sense of global higher education, to think about countries where we knew that there had been policies. We did have a kind of temporal cutoff, which I think was around the turn of the century. So at the point where we started working on this, last 20-ish years. So what we were looking for were countries where we knew about policies that had been introduced, which we felt would have an impact. You'll notice we don't say positive or negative. Of course, we're looking for positive where possible, but that's subjective, on the right to higher education. We then were also thinking about where the countries were based, so that we could try to bring in examples from quite different contexts. That led to our kind of main set of choices. From there, once we'd established and identified somebody who would be able to author the case studies. And as I mentioned, one of the things that for me was really important in this process was to make sure that the authors of the case studies were people with what I would call authentic expertise. So people either from that jurisdiction or with deep expertise in working on higher education in that system, who would author the case study. And at that point, it was more of a discussion with the authors for them to say, these are the policies that we think should be brought to the attention of readers. We did try to constrain it further, which is already hard, so that each case study only featured 2 or 3 policies, because we otherwise felt that we'd have this series of important but very unwieldy case studies. And what we really wanted to aim for with the case study format was readability and accessibility. And then each case study follows a similar template. So if you look at them, they're each about 15 to 20 pages. There's a bit of background, there's a bit of context around the country, there's a bit of context around education and the right to higher education. And then for each policy, it goes through a kind of, almost, if you imagine the sort of mythical policy cycle, right? Where did the idea for the policy come from? How did it get implemented? What does it consist of? And then in as far as there's been evaluation. So that was another consideration, is, has the policy been in effect long enough that we can get some data to understand, or some evidence to understand its effectiveness or impact? So then there's a bit of kind of analytical discussion in each of the case studies. So that sort of sets the framework, I think, which I hope responds to the question.
Thank you. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Esther, do you want to come in and?
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Hi, thank you, everyone. It's actually it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a bit of irony as well. because I'm actually a graduate from McGill. I'm from Brazil originally and started my higher education here back in the 90s. But then there was this 4-month program to McGill, and I ended up staying 12 years, staying for the master's and the PhD. But I've been back now for about 15 years. And in the last 12 or so, I've been working in the Ministry of Education here in Brazil, especially with data. So I stayed for about 10 years with K to 12, and now in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working with higher education quality assessment. And something that has been coming up a lot in our discussions here, in Brazil, since the 2000s, we've been having decade-long educational plans that the Congress study and put together and pass. And sometimes congressmen are more or less congruent to the reality of Brazil. So it's a big wish list. And we had the first one from 2001 to 2011, and then a gap there, a second one from 2014 that's just finished now in 2024. And the new one isn't out yet, and we're all curious to see what it brings, especially because both of the previous plans, and here's why I wanted you to talk more about what you saw in your study about student success, because both of the previous decade-long plans, when it came to higher education, all the goals were centered around access. So we want our population, our young people, to have access to higher education. And so we have had this drastic expansion of the higher education system in Brazil. And now a few colleagues of mine have been talking about this a lot, and they just published a study saying, if we can give you, Congress people who make these laws, but not always data-based laws or wishes, we would suggest that you didn't talk so much about access, but talked about success. Because the situation in Brazil is that in the last 20 years, the system has expanded so much that nowadays over 50% of our spots in the whole system, so universities and smaller colleges, private and public run, and also online courses, but also in person, we have more than 50% of the spots are idle. And we have a big recruitment problem in the age of YouTube and TikTok and all that. It's hard to recruit. But even for on-site presential free, federal funded university spots, we managed to fill less than 50% for the incoming students and about another 50 drop out. And 50 is a good number here, depending on where and courses and all that, it goes to 75%. So if you're talking about medicines, so then it'd be 20, 30. But we're talking about an installed capacity for accommodating students, but we haven't talked about how do you feel like you belong and you can make this something that is useful and enriching. So I'll be wondering to hear more about what you found in your studies about, recruitment, which is a more recent problem because it had always been the case that there weren't enough spots for everyone who wanted, but especially about preventing dropout. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's very nice to meet you and to learn also of your connection to McGill as well as your extensive experience working with the Ministry of Education in Brazil, which, colleagues who are not familiar with the context of Brazil, I think it's very important to say, it's one of the biggest higher education systems that we see in global context. It's also the most, if not the most, then one of the most privatized. Esther, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's around 70% of the system is private in Brazil. So, it really speaks, I think, to the importance of understanding the context and the specificities of each context before we can make any kind of universal or global comments about what can we do to improve X or reduce Y. That being said, this issue about as access to higher education has been expanded, in some contexts we also see dropout rates are higher than I think anybody would like them to be. And that's not necessarily a new phenomenon. I'm thinking of, I think, contexts where there may not be any requirements in order to enter higher education. And in those kind of contexts, we often see quite high dropout rates, especially after during or after the first year of higher education. And when we were launching this report just a few weeks ago, we had the case study author from Brazil, Cristina Fiorese, join us. And actually one of the aspects that she talks about very, I think, cogently and persuasively, which I think seems to be now on the ministerial radar as well, is what do we do? Right, you expand access to many more students, and particularly if governments are focusing, as they should, on equity deserving groups of students who've historically been underrepresented or marginalized, specifically from higher education. But then what we're not doing in the policy thinking is transferring that forward to say, what do we do with these students? And not what do we do with them, but how do we support them in higher education? Because we're still working on the expectation and the assumption that the student has to change to fit with the higher education. And that can affect so many different aspects of how we operate in higher education. It could be, what are we teaching students? Which thinkers are we teaching students when we talk about theory? And it can that's the immediate example that springs to mind. And Dr. Fiorese, when we were talking with her about this issue, is currently undertaking some very important research in the Brazilian context, looking precisely at this issue, as you mentioned, Esther, of belonging. And they've come up, their research has shown some very troubling findings. For example, a lot of discrimination among professors in terms of how they're relating to students who are coming in to higher education from backgrounds which haven't been as common in the past. And so I think at this point, there's a need to continue to build the evidence base in order to understand, and this isn't just me as a researcher saying we need to do more research, this is not trying to be self-fulfilling, but it's really to understand in our different contexts, what are the issues that students face. In many cases, they've gone through these huge hurdles and they've jumped over these huge hurdles to get into higher education. What happens when they're there? And I think that's where we have less of a good picture, and therefore might help to explain why the policy framework for supporting students for success or belonging or thriving, however you want to term it, is much less well developed. There may be examples that others could bring where we have got more evidence of that, but I think just if I was to kind of try to summarize from the case studies that we have in our collection, I think that's the kind of direction that I would be going with in response to the very interesting and important points that Esther's raised.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much, Emma, for the detailed response. We're getting a lot of questions in here. So
yeah.
You are probably first. You came in on the Q&A section, which is fine. Do you want to quickly ask your question? You might need me to unmute you. Let me just check.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay.
Thank you, Emma, for this nice presentation and very, very interesting comparative study on policy in higher education. So I guess you already answered a little bit what I'm going to ask, but I'm interested in knowing if countries, when they implement and think of policy on higher education, if you found any reference on adaptability, on how higher education systems or institutions adapt, become more pertinent, and maybe if there is some concern about the purpose of higher education in the different countries.
Are you thinking there? So sorry, thank you for the question. It's a very thought-provoking one. When you talk about adaptability, are you thinking kind of like how did they respond during the pandemic? What kind of things are you thinking about there, Jorge?
Well, I guess after the pandemic, it's been more evident that there is like an explosion of modalities options and opportunities with the development of technologies, the different technologies, and how higher education could be like looking more at what they do and how they offer the society and their students opportunities really to develop as persons, but also for the society. So in that sense is that I talk like the new types of certifications, credentials, several minors and majors, things like that. If you found anything like that in the different policies that you reviewed.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That is, as I said, it's a really interesting and thought-provoking question. I think you could make inferences around how, because we're thinking about this from a policy perspective, so we're thinking about governments in these case studies. So I think you can make inferences from the case studies around how governments see the purpose of higher education in terms of what kinds of policies are they implementing, how much commitment is demonstrated towards these policies. For example, how much money are they putting into them? If it is, for example, a financial aid program, is it more based around scholarships? Is it more based around loans? Is it more based around grants? So I think that enables us to understand that we could imply from that, what is it that governments are trying to say about how they value higher education, and how do they see its purpose? You don't see any of the countries reducing the size of their higher education systems. So that could be one very, I'm not sure if that's an important finding or not, but it is certainly an observation which is true across the 15 case study countries. And that may be partly because of the countries that we selected. As I mentioned in response to Rachel's question, we were looking specifically for countries where we know that there have been larger scale policies on the right to higher education. So you could therefore assume that we're looking at countries where there is, a vested interest in trying in some way to improve. I think the other kind of aspect that comes to mind in response to your question is countries where there's been regulation, or specifically like the creation of regulatory bodies to monitor like quality, to monitor provision. So Peru, for example, with its body SUNEDU, would be quite an interesting one perhaps for you to have a look at. So that, in a sense, is an adaptive mechanism. In Peru, the context has been of quite rapid privatization and expansion at the same time in the higher education system. And suddenly it's as if there was a realization that if you leave that untrammeled, then there are going to be, some issues to do with quality, and to do with, this is before we even get to thinking about what a student's experience is in higher education, how are they getting on when they're in. So the creation then of SUNEDU, which as a regulatory body has had a very rocky and politicized story, I think would be quite an interesting one to look at. So I think I can't kind of give a yes, no answer, but I think you can see examples and you can make some inferences from these case studies, which I think could respond in part to some of the things that you're interested in understanding more about.
Thank you, Emma.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. That was very interesting. We're running out of time as always. I'm going to ask if we can have 3 more questions and ask really quickly, and then Emma can choose which bits she wants to respond. So you were first. Helen, you asked if you could summarize your question around your retention programs, and Shibao was about what's happening right now in America. Lee.
Right. Hi, Emma. Thanks for a brilliant talk. Wanted to ask you about the interface between politics or policy and politics. And I'm stricken by the geographic scope of the studies and the cases that you selected here, thinking about also the policies that you've looked at and how, many of them are fit within sort of either centrist or center left or harder left political paradigms. But seeing in the countries you've selected, there's quite a lot of political swing to far left, far right, especially in Latin America. So wondering like how much does politics become a liability for the efficacy and sustainability of those policies? And I should just give a nod to Shibel, whose question I think speaks exactly to that on DEI in the case of the States.
Yeah, so another really interesting question, thank you, Lee, and one which we had quite a lot of discussion around internally when we were looking, so I sort of drafted the report and was thinking about how can we talk about, the flavor of government. And in an earlier iteration, what I had thought about doing was sort of trying to understand, if we could broadly categorize the kind of government that we were looking at on a right-left spectrum relative to when policies were introduced, would that be meaningful? And we quite quickly concluded that it would not, partly because, it would be it could be highly problematic to try and kind of categorize a government just on this sort of left-right spectrum, which I think increasingly we're seeing isn't quite working in order to understand, what governments are doing. I mean, just look at Quebec, where I'm based. The type of government we have there, it would be quite hard to categorize it on that kind of left-right. So that's a different issue, I think, for political scientists to take up. But also, what it just felt it felt too much like we were trying to ascribe causation. And so I think the point that you're making is a very important one. There is absolutely, of course, going to be a link between politics and policies. Anything that's done by government is going to, have some kind of political inclination towards it. And we see, what's happening in the US right now. US was not one of the case studies, but I'm sure many of us have been observing some of the most recent knee-jerk reactions which are happening over in the US. And so you can see that that's absolutely, coming from a place of political ideology around how the world should be ordered and, what is the place of education within that. Now, that's beyond the scope, I think. So here, this is me talking now with my hat on as a McGill researcher around, what I'm seeing, and in my own work where I look at, politics and policy in higher education. But with that hat on, I could also think about some earlier research that I've done looking at, the politics of international student recruitment in some of the high sort of majority Anglophone recruiting nations. And you can see the impact of politics. If you look at the first time Trump came in the US, for example, you see a dip in the number of international students going into the US. Similarly, after there was some dreadful racist murders in Australia of Indian students, you see a dip in the number of students going from India to Australia. This is now more than 10 years ago. However, the other thing that you see is that that's fairly short term. And if you think about, why in this particular case I'm moving away from the Right to Higher Education report and more to thinking about, international students as a very easy and obvious way of looking at kind of the impact of international politics in our kind of connected higher education kind of massive ecosystem here. These effects we often also see that they can be quite short term. So over the long run, if you kind of look at the impact of where international students are going and what they're doing, that tends to be the political impact tends to be obvious and deep, but also not long lasting. And I'm saying that with a slightly hesitant, it's not a conclusion, it's a kind of let's keep following this. So it's not an answer in response to the report, but it is some thoughts about the connections between, political flavors of governments and then how that plays out in policy. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to riff a bit on that.
That's great. I mean, we probably should wrap up. It's 3 o'clock. But,
Yeah.
but Shibel, having asked that question, do you want to comment on how that you think that looks? Is it short term? Is it long term? Shibel, are you there? Can you do you want to speak?
Okay, so can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can indeed, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, so what you alluded to earlier already, Emma, so I'm just wondering, and I guess about the drastic changes to DEI at university in the US, and particularly, I guess, how that impact the right of to higher education, particularly for equity deserving group, particularly indigenous groups, and what kind of signals that was sent to the globalized world.
Yeah, I think, I can't answer the question on the basis of the Reaching for the Right to Higher Education report. As I mentioned, the US is not one of the case studies. We also, in the case studies, don't have a situation where what we were tracking in the case studies were policies that have been implemented and have continued to be kind of, for the most part, have continued actually to be in operation. We didn't have an opportunity from any of the cases to see an issue where a policy came in, but it was reversed, which is, I think, some of what we're seeing now start to unfold in the US. So as I kind of have alluded to in responding to Lee's question, as a researcher at McGill, I have thoughts about how that might make an impact, but it's not an area that we covered with this particular report, unfortunately.
No, and I think it's just we wouldn't expect you to, because otherwise the report would always go immediately out of date. So we totally get get your sort of reserve there, and thank you for commenting more broadly about the sort of the awareness of it being
It's a huge privilege to be given the space to do
Yes,
it. So thank you, and thanks for such an interesting set of questions. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to all of them.
Yes, thank you all, and apologies if I didn't get to you. Please do follow up with them if you'd like to afterwards, and please everyone do read the report. It's and of course the case studies, they sound like they're really a great deep dive. It's always a pleasure to chat. Thank you very much for your time today, and please come back soon. Thank you everyone for coming. Next week we'll be back again 2 p.m. the same time. Do join us for another CG webinar. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone.